to thank. And with all of that said, I feel like the disclaimer, we talked about this in the Bible study this morning, is what does Paul say? Like, this is not coming from the divine, it's from me. It's a disclaimer that should be on every sermon. Drifting apart. Drifting apart is a phrase that I hear all too often when counseling couples whose marriages are in distress. Like the subtle shift of forces unseen are operating underneath, moving bodies away from each other. Drifting apart might refer to individuals as much as whole communities, groups, societies, and the world at large. We are drifting apart. I must confess to you as we begin that I'm not excited to be standing in the pulpit this morning, having what one colleague recently described as the unenviable task of preaching on these particular texts. If we were following the canons of the Episcopal Church, preaching from the Revised Common Lectionary this week, we would be hearing from the Gospel of John and Jesus' prediction of his own death and resurrection, as is the tradition on the final Sunday in Lent, appropriately so as we consider all that comes in the week ahead. In comparison to these lessons, compiled and translated for us by the Reverend Dr. Wilda Gaffney in a women's lectionary for the whole church, centered today, as they are, on various teachings about marriage and parenting. A sermon on death and the mysteries of resurrection seems like almost a holiday. After all, few subjects have the capacity to trigger our deepest feelings of hurt, anger, shame, and grief like the subject of divorce. I stand here today knowing full well that in our country, with one of the highest divorce rates in the world, nearly half of all first marriages will end in breakup. The divorce rate, we know, goes up considerably for second and third marriages. What that means, among other things, is that each of us is touched by divorce. Whether we ourselves have been divorced, or have close loved ones who have been divorced, or parents who are. But is it any surprise, in a culture so defined by drift, separation, isolation, and so at odds with each other, that we would experience such a high rate of breakups and broken relationships? We are drifting apart, and it seems there is nowhere to point the finger. While many of us have found divorce to be life-giving, liberating even, to be the escape from abuse or disentanglement from toxic dynamics of a relationship gone awry, or even more simply, the beginning of self-discovery and a doorway to new and even more profound love, still many others cannot think of it without thinking of the pain, the loss, the magnitude of the difficulty that came with dissolving not only deep, intimate connection and years of personal involvement, but the economic and physical and legal complexity that comes with breaking up a marriage. Add to this mixture the reality that we are recalling all these things in the church, an institution that has, without fail, failed miserably across the centuries to deal with the issue of divorce in ways that are compassionate, respectful, and pastoral, means that this topic is doubly fraught as we encounter it here inside these four walls. So what are we to do? What is your preacher to say? Well, there are some interpretive moves that we could make that are helpful. One can note, as some scholars do, that the fact that Jesus prohibits divorce in Mark, making some accommodation in Matthew for it in cases of adultery, that Jesus shows a deep care for women and for children who, the argument follows, would have been left destitute and vulnerable in society in cases of divorce where they already had very little standing. The Reverend Dr. Gaffney notes, though, that both men and women, particularly women of means, did have access, actually, to divorce in the first century. So, while this interpretive move might be partially true, it still feels rather thin. And in a contemporary world where women rightly hold more power and autonomy, such a reading feels like it inadvertently reinscribes notions of helplessness and a latent patriarchy cloaked in chivalry, which is unhelpful in today's world. Still, others note that this is not truly a passage just about marriage and divorce, or principally about marriage and divorce after all. The story is, they say, yet another instance of Jesus' ongoing dispute with the Pharisees. Those poor guys catch the brunt of all of the Gospels. Rather, it was their ongoing attempts to catch Jesus in a trap, some scholars say. In contrast to the Reverend Dr. Gaffney's, in complement to the Reverend Dr. Gaffney's translation, the New Revised Standard Version says just straight out, they came to test him. Dr. Gaffney says they asked him a question. Okay, that was also to test him. I confess this lesson feels like a test, like a trap that is loaded and set. What can the church say that will undo the centuries of damage, the broken lives and painful memories provided by the rules and laws the church has created itself or undergirded and upheld in our own institution and in society at large? I'm not sure we can fix this. How often has the church played the part of the Pharisees in regards to these teachings and many, many others? Seeing the gospel not as freedom, but as a set of laws and rules, new laws and rules to be followed, instead of as a story about Jesus' way of love and how it liberates and reconciles across the many lines of difference our world so often arbitrarily imposes. If we are divided, if we are drifting apart, if the world is shattered into parts and pieces, how can the gospel, how can we, following Jesus' way of love, even begin to put things back together? I'm convinced that if we focus on this passage as a set of further rules about marriage and divorce, we will, in fact, be creating not less, but more lines of division, as the church so often has done, between the righteous and the sinner, the insider and the outsider, those who belong and those who do not. It's not that our faith should be silent on matters of marriage and divorce. Truth is, as the Reverend Dr. Gaffney's lectionary selections show, the Bible and our faith can be used to support all kinds of social institutions and constructs, some less savory than others. Think here of slavery and monarchy. Lamech, in this morning's Old Testament lesson, seems to be inventing polygamy, and God does not condemn it. At the same time, Paul seems to be encouraging, among many options, celibacy as the best. These are no longer normative practices in our society and culture, just as new ways of being in relationship, chosen family, for instance, or same-sex marriage, or lifelong partnerships, polyamory, and other ways of connecting have become more commonplace. It could be just as easy to use Scripture to support or condemn these practices, just as the church has used Scripture to support heteronormative marriage and to condemn divorce. Or we could use Scripture, as I think you and I might agree it should be, to reflect on the power of love present in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth, of how that self-offering love heals the divides, that reverses the drift that we may experience, not only in our personal lives and relationships, but especially and even more importantly, in the world around us. It never ceases to amaze me how easily the church, even our beloved Episcopal Church, slips into a kind of legalism, using Scripture to lend credence to creating more rules and rubrics, higher walls and thicker barriers in a world already drifting apart, especially when all we crave is community, connection, and healing. We crave to come together, and we yearn for it. Clint Smith, in his beautiful poem titled Pangaea, writes about how things drift apart and about this human desire to come together. Imagine, he says, imagine each continent a splintered tessellation of wayward fragments, each mass of land attempting to jostle itself free. Pangaea was the last of the supercontinents, a mass of land that came together and broke itself apart several times before. He says, I find myself blaming Pangaea for the sounds I cannot hear. I decry the continents for their careless drift. I detest the tectonic plates for their indifferent quake. I wake up in love with the ocean and fall asleep despising all it has put between us. Perhaps if the continents had never shaken themselves free, we might find ourselves disabused of this apathy. Perhaps if we could hear the bomb dropping, we might imagine what would happen if it struck our own homes. I'm nostalgic, he writes, for a proximity that may not have mattered. Over a decade ago, St. John's was engaged in the tricky work of studying human sexuality for the first time as a faith community. A constitutional amendment was on the ballot in our state that would seek to define marriage as between one man and one woman. The language of faith was being used by those in favor of the amendment and those opposed. And a concerned member of the community came to me to say how concerned he was that we would, as a church, come out against this amendment, that we would use our scripture and our faith as a reason to get involved in a political process. After all, he said, if we do it this time, what's to stop us doing it the next, or the next, or the next? Each time our faith compels us to speak up on behalf of those on the margins. And I'll confess to you now, I remember as a young rector, a newly appointed rector of this community, how terrified I was. New to this role of leadership, that somehow that same leadership would somehow be a part of pulling our community apart internally, that this decision would alienate some and push them away. So I assured him, don't worry, that's not going to happen. Of course, you all know what has happened in the decades since here. How involved our parish has gotten and continues to be in matters of conscience, discovering and proclaiming the ever-widening circle of God's love and grace and welcome. We're doing it not for our own good, because that would be selfish. We're doing it because our faith compels us to, because it's the right thing. You see, every time we have done this, our parish has gotten involved in matters of conscience, discovering and proclaiming that ever-widening circle of God's love, of grace and welcome. You see, that's the gospel writ large. Every time we ask of Jesus what his way of love means, whether it has room for this or that person, the answer is always and ever yes. Yes, it does. You see, in a world that is often drifting apart, widening the circle can feel like a slippery slope, and it kind of is, but it's a lot of fun. The Gospels are ever and always calling us to consider our lives in relation to each other, across all the lines that divide, especially the lines that we've created that divide us. Jesus' way calls us to proclaim a healing that only divine love can bring. A healing that makes us care for and seek to include not just those nearest to us, but indeed even a world away and an ocean apart. In a world that is drifting apart, we might think that hard rules and stricter laws will save us. And instead, we might find that we crash into them and they break us further apart. And we learn that it is love, manifest on a cross and in an empty tomb, that can bring us together.